Next order, Mr. Clerk.
House Joint Resolution 8 by Chairman Todd, a resolution to make application to Congress of the United States pursuant to Article 5 of the United States Constitution to call a joint convention proposing amendments to set limits on number of terms to which a person may be elected as a member of the United States House of Representatives and to set a limit on the number of terms to which a person may be elected as a member of the United States Senate.
Chairman Todd, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move adoption of HJR8.
Chairman Todd moves adoption. Properly seconded. Mr. Clerk, any amendments been filed?
Mr. Speaker, no amendments filed.
Chairman Todd, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, what this resolution does, it calls for Congress to set a time and a place for a convention, an Article 5 convention as laid out in our Constitution of the United States, for one express purpose, and that is for setting term limits on the U.S. Congress. Our founders put this in the Constitution. It has never been used to this date because Congress has always appointed these amendments to the states to ratify. But as you well know, Congress is not going to limit themselves. They have proven this over and over. As a matter of fact, President Eisenhower even was quoted after Congress passed and states ratified the term limits on the office of president in 1954, that an amendment for congressional term limits could never achieve the blessing of Congress. It could be initiated only by the states. And that is, as you well know, the truth. So it is, I think, beholden on us to do that. And this mechanism was laid out by our founders and supported by our founders to give states that option to petition Congress to set a time and place. And then we send delegates that would then vote on whatever issue we ask them to, exactly how we ask them to. This body, the General Assembly, we control those delegates, and they must do what we tell them to. Otherwise, it's a felony. And we can call them back and appoint new delegates. But the main thing about this is that some of the concerns that have been expressed is that this could go off the rails and rules could be changed, the Constitution could be changed without us ratifying it. And that could be no further from the truth. The rules are laid out, how to ratify the Constitution. And we all have been bound to uphold the Constitution. This is one tool within it that states can control Congress in this situation. So I appreciate your support, and I renew my motion.
Chairman Todd renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Weaver, you are recognized.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Sponsor. I have the highest respect for you, but members, I rise in opposition of this. I have stood before previous sessions when this kind of legislation came before the body. I believe it's dangerous. We have not had a convention since 1787. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that some people that I respect, like the late former Justice Scalia, is quoted as saying, whoa, we don't want a convention. What can happen when we open that up? And that's my question I'm asking you. I mean, we don't have control over those delegates. We haven't, and I'll just have you check in what has happened lately here in Congress. We don't have the control over those delegates. And in this climate, in this political climate, we're going to risk opening up our Constitution for it to be a Trojan horse to go in there and totally give us something new. For 60 years, globalists have wanted to come for our Constitution. And may I just suggest this? Our Constitution is the only thing that protects us as citizens. Our Second Amendment, a holy grail for globalists to come and take that from us. And this, in my humble opinion, is a way they can get to it. And don't think they're not trying to take our Second Amendment. That is the only thing that keeps us citizens instead of subjects. So I want you to really think hard about what we're doing here. You know, the buzzword is term limits. Last year it was balanced budget. The year before that it was limited government. And those are things that we as conservatives really embrace. But may I suggest to you that this is a Trojan horse to open a Pandora's box to literally change our Constitution. And then I might add in closing, term limits. Think about that. It's a nice, warm, fuzzy word. But have you really thought the process through, what happens when you have term limits? Number one, first thing that comes to mind is you have a lazy voting populace. People know that, oh, they're going to be in there 2 years and they're going to be right out. So the elected member could go up there and do nothing but damage for 2 years and not be accountable for any of that. Plus, even the voting citizen will say, oh, she's only going to be up there 2 years, so what the heck? We'll put somebody else in there the next time. I want you to seriously think about what you're about to do. This is dangerous. They've been trying to do this for 60 years, and we don't have a problem with our Constitution. Not one problem. What we do have is people who don't listen to it or abide by it. Thank you, members. Please consider doing it. I stand in opposition of this, and I have a high regard for the sponsor. But thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, members.
Chairman Todd, anything?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess a couple of things. There was a lot there that I have to work with, and I appreciate my colleague from Smith County and her passion for this. We've been carrying on about this for the last few weeks, and I appreciate her comments. I will point you to a 2014 law that this General Assembly passed that was the faithful delegate law. So it literally binds our delegates. She says we have no control over those, but and that has been purported by others, but we do, in fact, have full control over our delegates. Also, the quote from Justice Scalia is somewhat taken out of context. I would submit that the rest of that quote was, but if there were a targeted amendment that was adopted by the states, Article 5, I think the only provision I would amend is the amendment provision. So there's a more complete quote there that where he actually supported an Article 5 convention. We're not talking about a convention, a constitutional convention. There's only been one of those. When we formed the Constitution, that was a constitutional convention. And I have a number of quotes from James Madison that defends that, and I can certainly give you those. But, Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'll renew my motion.
Representative Griffey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers and members and the representative. Thank you for bringing this legislation. I have the utmost respect for you. I, too, when I was initially approached to support the Convention of States, it sounded like a good idea for term limits. However, I submit to you, I join the comments of my colleague that this is a Trojan horse. This is a classic bait and switch. This is a well-financed campaign by those that want to get their hands on our Constitution, and they're dangling term limits out there for us to bite on. With all due respect, I disagree with my representative, the sponsor of the bill, that we can control the delegates. I spoke with our esteemed professor of law, Glenn Reynolds, about this precise issue in controlling the delegates. And his opinion was, as mine has been looking at other legal scholars, constitutional scholars, conservative constitutional scholars, says once the delegates are selected, they become federal officers. And state law cannot bind and control the federal officers. And this is exactly what happened in 1789, when we had the initial, the delegates were supposed to go and amend the Articles of Confederation. Well, what the delegates did is they said, you know what, let's just start all over. We're going to do a whole new Constitution. And it turned out great for us. But in this political climate, are you going to put your faith in the people that are running the country in D.C. right now to come up with simply address term limits? I'm sorry, I don't have that faith and trust in our political body of America these days, and I would urge you all to vote against this dangerous proposal. Thank you.
Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will point you to that faithful delegate law where it specifically says if a commissioner votes outside of their instructions, their vote is void and null. If the commissioner votes outside their instructions, they forfeit their position. It's a Class E felony punishable by up to 6 years in jail for a commissioner to vote outside of the resolution calling for the convention or the further instructions from the General Assembly. As I said, this body controls the delegates by law. I'll also point you to quotes by James Madison in Federalist 40, where he states, referring to the delegates, and what has been stated here in many emails that you've received, that this could be that the original convention for forming a constitution was actually a runaway. Could be nothing further from the truth. According to James Madison, they were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of government and of the nation, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation into such form as to accomplish these purposes. They went with the express purpose of creating a constitution out of what we had. They did not run away. That was their charge by the states. The states had control of that completely. They directed that. Again, I'd be glad to take any other comments or questions, but I'll point you to something on a state level. It kind of took a little bit for me to get my hands around this and make sure I could associate this with something that we deal with here in this General Assembly. We have 95 counties in this state that are subdivisions of the state. We have given them the authority to exist. If all 95 counties got together next week in a convention, or whatever they want to call it, and they decide they don't like the speed limit on Interstate 40 that you and I, many of us here travel every week, and they decide that 60 miles an hour is a better speed limit, and they decide among themselves by 2/3 majority or 3/4 majority, let's say 72 counties vote in the affirmative to change the Interstate 40 speed limit to 60 miles an hour, effective immediately. Do any of you think that next week that the state troopers will start writing tickets for anything over 60? They will not, because nothing changed. Even though those delegates from those counties thought they changed state law, our Constitution says only we change that law. That's no different than what our federal Constitution says about how to amend the Constitution. It takes 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of this meeting. An Article 5 convention, any substance from that has to be ratified by 38 states. We will get a bite at that apple. We will get a chance, as we did in the early part of the last century, to ratify the amendment giving women the right to vote. That came to the states. Tennessee was the final nail in that coffin. We established that once and for all. So I would submit to you that we have the final say in this. This cannot be runaway. This cannot change our laws or our rules or our Constitution unless we, in fact, as a state, change that. So, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Representative Shaw, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my colleague yield, please? Thank you. I rose. I don't want to get in the weeds and talk about Republicans or about Democrats. I just want to talk about people in general. Personally, I think that if we pass this law and it becomes law, I think we take the voting rights of the people away. I've been here 20 years. I'm under term limits. And if the people didn't want me to come back, they would have voted me out. I don't think it's necessary for us to do this, because the people who are in Washington and the people who are in Nashville and wherever they are, however long they've been serving because it was the will of the people that elected them to come back, whether they were right or wrong. And sometimes who I think's wrong might be right for somebody else. So I think we take the will of the people away when we put term limits on people. Under those conditions, I can't vote for this, because I wouldn't give the people in my district an opportunity to exercise their real right to vote. And secondly, in 2 years, it takes you that long to find out where the bathroom is. And if you're going to be effective and to help someone, you need to be in government long enough to understand how to help people. So with that in mind, whether you're Democrat or Republican, I think you ought to have a right to choose whoever you want to serve if that's your will. Thank you.
Representative Zachary. Oh, sorry, Chairman Todd, you have something you'd like to say?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that. And I appreciate my colleagues' comments. I certainly do, and I certainly take those to heart. I've wrestled with the same issue. You know, where am I on this based on the will of the voters? But I submit to you that we didn't have a restriction on the president's office until 1954. Our founders never dreamed that anyone would go to Congress or be president for a lifetime. But that's what we have now. That's the reality. When you're in that position, the finances you garner in your campaign account literally prevents others from ever having a chance at that seat as long as you can master that kind of money. That's what we see day to day. That is the real world that we have. Many of you know on a state level, some of my colleagues here have beat entrenched incumbents that were chairmen of big committees that had plenty of money and beat them with less than $20,000. So the state level is totally, it's a different game, as you all know. You see it every 2 years, we see that turnover. But on a congressional level, it's a different world. I've had it said to me that the safest job in America is a U.S. Senator. Once you get it, you keep it for as long as you want, because that power is so entrenched there. And again, I point you back to the amendment, rather, the 22nd Amendment that puts term limits on the U.S. presidency. There was a reason for doing that. We have a reason now with what we see day to day and year to year, decade after decade in Congress. So, Mr. Speaker, I renew my motion.
Representative Zachary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members actually rise in support of this legislation. So many times we stand in this body and we quote the Constitution, we reference the Constitution, and every word of the Constitution is important. So I don't understand why, if we call ourselves constitutionalists, this particular aspect of the Constitution doesn't apply, because the words are very clear, and the founders gave us a recourse as states on the federal government to check the power of the federal government. And if you read Article 5, it says, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. A convention to propose amendments. And if you look at the words written in Federalist 485 by Alexander Hamilton, he said, by the 5th article of the plan, we may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachment of the national authority. And it's also important to remember that during the Constitutional Convention of September 15th, 1787, Article 5 was debated vigorously, but passed unanimously by our founders who gave us the Constitution. So if you say you're a constitutionalist, but every aspect of the Constitution applies, but this particular section of Article 5, I'm not sure how those two correlate. Chairman, thank you for bringing this. I fully support it because I support the Constitution. I support the words of the Constitution. And as Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 85, we as the state legislatures have been given the power to erect barriers against the encroachment of the federal government, and that's exactly what this does. So thank you for bringing it.
Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that comment. I really appreciate that. And it does point to a fact that I think a lot of us would appreciate. Our founders were states' rights activists. They wrote the Constitution to give states the power, not the federal government. Subsequent to passage of the Constitution, they fought tooth and nail to keep the power with the states. We have somehow over many decades let that end up in the hands of the federal government. This is one article within that Constitution that gives us the ability to take some of that back. I just submit to you that this is one of our responsibilities to adhere to, and I appreciate your support of this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Jernigan.
Thank you. And sponsor, I spoke about this in committee, and I'm opposed to really all Article 5s, and because of the the faithful delegate. The faithful delegate law we passed here, yes, there's punishments. Yes, you have to do what state law says. But there's nothing that prevents a delegate from going down to wherever this convention's held to go to federal court and say to a judge, I believe Tennessee's law is unconstitutional. And when they do say that, the judge says, you're right, it's unconstitutional. Now we're talking about Article 3 of the Constitution that gives the federal government the power of the judiciary to say that a state's law is unconstitutional. And that could very well happen. I don't see, at that point, Tennessee can't punish the delegate because it's been ruled unconstitutional. So Article 3 is just as important as Article 5, and for that reason, I don't support any Article 5 legislation. So thank you, sponsor, and I appreciate, I have respect for you, but I can't vote for the bill.
Chairman Todd, you're recognized.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate those comments. I think that issue by itself, to me, doesn't change a vote. We still have to ratify whatever comes out of that convention. I believe the states, I don't believe there's anything unconstitutional with us directing our delegates and holding them accountable. That would be debated in court. I can understand that. I believe we would win that argument. But either way, anything that comes out of that convention comes right here to this General Assembly to approve. If we don't ratify it, it doesn't become part of the Constitution. Nothing changes. But it is a shot across the bow at Congress that we're serious about this. That's another factor that we need to look at. What we do today tells Congress we want to hold you responsible. So I just admonish you to really consider that heavily. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
All right, Representative Cassada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative, I applaud your hard work on this bill. It's not the Constitutional Convention that concerns me. It's the meat of the matter, which is term limits. As we think of our activities here, it's our knowledge that we're represented by the people that keeps the bureaucracy from running state government. In my opinion, currently federal government is ran too much by the bureaucracy. And so if you take out the experience, all of a sudden bureaucrats, unelected individuals will be running federal government. That concerns me greatly. And so I'm voting no, because I like to depend upon my chairmen, upon you, and the knowledge that everyone in this room has, and the authority that's been given to you by the electorate to stop those that are unelectable, unaccountable. So thank you for your hard work. It's not that I oppose, again, the Constitutional Convention. It's the meat of the matter, which is term limits. I think the people should have that right of term limits, not us. Thank you.
Chairman Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would point out, and I appreciate my colleagues' comments on that, and that's debatable, whether you feel like an entrenched group of folks that have been there for many, many years, being reelected year after year because they have tremendous bank accounts, are actually accountable to the people, and are actually watching the bureaucracy. I would submit they are part of the bureaucracy. They become part of the bureaucracy. That's the way the system has become, and we need to put a stop to that. I will mention polling across this great state of your constituents, and you've been getting the emails and phone calls just like I have, average 78%, and that's across all party lines. This is term limits on U.S. Congress is it polls very, very high in this state. Any way you want to ask the question, it polls very high. So our constituents are demanding this. This is the number one thing when I go home on the weekend that I get talked about. People stop me at church. I appreciate what you're doing on term limits. We've got to put some controls on Congress. Constantly get that. The only negatives I get are from the national organizations that are pushing against this because they are probably recipients of some of that power that's entrenched. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Kershaw, we're working. I see everybody. I mean, we've got a list. Representative Kershaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to my good friend and colleague from West Tennessee. I very rarely speak up on bills where I'm not moving an amendment from judiciary or from criminal. And I also very rarely vote no on the House floor. So I just wanted, out of respect for you, just let you know kind of where my heart was. I also get talked to about term limits quite a bit when I go back home. But I engage in the conversation, and once we get into the layers a little bit, I actually find that people, they're not real clear on what term limits would really mean for them. And so what I want to remind folks is that our founders wanted the rights of minorities and of rural communities to be just as important as well-heeled folks from big cities like New York and San Francisco. We put in term limits, and the folks that are going to run the committees and going to have all the power are the people from the wealthy communities. That's just how it's going to go. And so if we want a country that's run by New York and San Francisco, then term limits are your plan. I mean, that is my fear, right? So I've talked to many other of our colleagues from other states where they have term limits, and I had one person tell me, they said, yeah, because of term limits, as soon as I got elected, I had 15 lobbyists in my office telling me how I was going to run my committee. And to be honest, I didn't know how to run my committee, so I needed as much advice as I could get. And then one of them said, yeah, and the day I was elected speaker, of course, I can only serve 2 terms, and it was just my turn to be speaker. I had to turn to the bureaucracy to tell me how to be a speaker, how to run my office. And so I realize this is a very popular notion. I know your heart is absolutely in the right place, and I too was tempted. I have talked about, you know, the magic of term limits before I really thought about it. But if we want New York and San Francisco telling flyover country what to do, then let's have term limits. But if we want the rights of rural America, of rural Tennessee to be represented, then I think we ought to think long and hard before we do something like this. So that's why, out of all due respect, I just wanted you to know why I will be voting no this morning. It's not because I like the idea of folks being entrenched or being able to stick around for a long time, but if we want New York and San Francisco telling us what to do, then this is their dream bill. Thank you.
Chairman Todd, anything? Nope. Representative Sparks.
Thank you. With the sponsor yield. Sponsor, I just want to thank you for your courage and conviction on this. You know, a lot of times when we're deliberating up here, I think of my late World War II father who flew 24 bombing raids on the B-17, and I think about the debt of this nation, where this country is going. Our founding fathers didn't intend for folks to go to Congress and the Senate, maybe worth $100,000, come out worth millions of dollars, serving 30 and 40 and 50 years. I encourage you to vote for this, and thank you, sponsor, for bringing this. Maybe this is a small tool in the toolbox to get this country back to basics. We're $28 trillion in debt, $1.8 trillion in student debt. What's being done about it? I don't see anything. We're leaving the next generation in debt, bankrupt. So thank you, sir.
Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Call for the previous question.
Previous question has been called. Any objection? Seeing none. All those in favor of House Joint Resolution 8 vote aye when the bell rings. Those opposed vote no. As every member voted, does any member wish to change their vote? Mr. Clerk, take the vote.
Ayes 53, 34 nays, 4 present on voting.
House Joint Resolution 8 and received constitutional majority. I hereby declare it adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is tabled. Call up next bill, Mr. Clerk.
House Bill 961 by Chairman Whitson relative to immunity.
Chairman Whitson, you are recognized.